remember horse and buggy days. Well, on my daddy's side, they came from around Fernwood, Mississippi, his father did.
Mm-hmm. And his name was what?
Madison Jones King.
Madison Jones King.
Keen. K-E-E-N.
Okay.
And he had a twin sister. When my daddy first got married, he ran the theater in Kentwood as well as other work he did. And my grandfather was a blacksmith, and they had the blacksmith shop there next to their home in Kentwood. We moved to a little place called Scanlon, Louisiana. That's where I was born. And I lived there till I was about 5 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And moved from there. We went to Kentwood for a little while. And then we went to a place called Northfield Camp. And we lived there for a while. And then we moved back to the town of Northfield. And that's where my brother Lonnie was born. I don't know how many years we stayed there. And then we moved to a little place called Pine Grove. And it was a lumber camp for the Nadal Lumber Company. And I got a little story in my Bible that I tell of the move that we made from the Pine Grove to Doyle, Louisiana, and how they took our house apart, and room by room they took it on logs to load it onto a flat car to carry it. And I've got a little story in my Bible that I've written about our move from there. And it's kind of interesting. They moved them they broke the houses apart into rooms. And they put them on logs and had mules to carry them to the train and lift them on the flat car and carry them to the next town. That was going with a girlfriend of mine. He brought him up and introduced us. And I said, I'll tell you, the first date we went on, we went to a fire. My girlfriend could not go with us that night for some reason. And so just about the time that we left her house, the fire whistle blew. So we went and watched the house burn. And that was our first date. No, I was not chaperone. I tell you, I started dating when I was about 14 because my daddy didn't want my sister to date till she was 16, and I went along as a chaperone. But I had a date also. He never, I don't know whether he ever knew about all those things that we did. He was kind of strict with us. We just sometimes just parked and talked, and we went on weenie roasts, toasted marshmallows, but we went out to the river on the riverbank to build fires and all, to do all of our weenie roasts and all. But I never did really single date anybody except Wilton, because there's always a crowd of us. We went as a group of young people. We had a good time, and we'd go to one of the girls' houses, and maybe a bunch of boys would show up, and we'd all pile in a little car and go for a ride. And that was about the time, that Wilton and I were married in 1947. They rationed shoes, sugar, most everything. I know even when Frank was a baby, we went to a boarding house in Hazelhurst when Wilton had a job with the railroad, and he thought he was going to be stationed at Hazelhurst, but he wasn't. And so we went up there and stayed for a couple of weeks. Then we moved up to a little place called Pneumonia. It was between Jackson, Mississippi and Yazoo City. And we stayed there until war started. And my baby was about 2 months old when he got his call to come to service. He came back and he had the opportunity to get a job in Hammond. And so that's where we lived.
Right.
Most of our married life was in Hammond. Hubert was born in 38. Betty was born, and Frank was born in 41, and Betty was born in 43. I was married and living in Independence when they had the tornado in Amet that tore the town center completely apart, and my parents were hurt seriously in that storm. And so they went to the hospital, and we had to take care of them there. Then they built them a house there in Amet again, and they got back to their normal life. He wasn't. He was. His brother was. But he was very.
That's Hubert.
Yeah, we had a platform from the post office, and were giving out fruit to all the children in the community. So, and then they had entertainment, and we went up there. And so when Frank went up to get his fruit, they were playing Dashing Through the Snow in a one-horse open sleigh. And so the man called Frank over there, said, "Can you sing that?" And Frank says, "I sure can." And he started singing. And so the man said, "Sure enough, he can sing." And they called him Frank Bean, my daughter. I had a brother between us, but he, as an infant, was sick, and he only lived a month.
Mm-hmm.
But then I was born. Dora was born. And then Lonnie's younger. And then I had a sister, Nelda, and two brothers, Donald, and the younger brother, Ted. We didn't go on, big vacations. We always go visit someone.
Mm-hmm.
My grandmother's brothers and all lived up at Tylertown, Mississippi. We used to go up there every summer. My grandfather was an engineer on the railroad from New Orleans to Jackson, Mississippi. He caught pneumonia, and I'm not just sure how my grandmother got pneumonia, but Mama was left an orphan at 2, and she lived with her grandmother in New Orleans until she was about 11 years old, and she moved to Chattaway, Mississippi, with relatives and lived there. We moved about quite a bit. Oh, but I've been on the move all my life. Oh. Well, my daddy always had work, and we never had too much difference except things were rationed, and we couldn't get just everything we wanted. But my daddy was always had a job. And then we still was in depression when Wilton and I was married. And he worked on what they call the WPA, which was a group that Roosevelt had made jobs for people. He helped build schools, helped build roads. And Red worked as a surveyor one time. All up and down the California coast. I've been, that was after my son was a Marine, and he was stationed out there all up and down. So I've been along the California coast from San Diego up to Monterey. My oldest son went to the Naval Academy, and when he graduated, he went out to Monterey, California for a postgraduate school. And we went out there and visited him. And it was really interesting there. We went all along the coast. Saw the great sequoia forest, huge trees that a car could go through, the hollowed out one.
You went home?
We didn't have money to go on honeymoons then.
Yeah.
He was working with his daddy on the farm right then. He had opportunity to go work for the railroad. So we followed railroad work. Oh, once in a while.
Once in a while?
I never did. I never did go down for the main parades. My husband's mother and father moved down there for a while, but they had work down there, and so we went down and we'd go to the lesser parades. And then after my daughter married, her husband worked at a hospital that the parades passed right by, and we'd go down there and watch the parades from the hospital. And people that were on the floats that knew him would throw great big bundles of beads. And of course my grandchildren would give the brothers that didn't get any throws, they'd divide their beads with them. Oh yeah, I was a good cake maker and pie maker. Used to make lemon pies that everybody wanted some of them when I took them anywhere. Oh, flower arrangements, I worked in the, I started when I worked in Woolworth Company. I made a little arrangement to take to a friend in the hospital. And my manager came by and saw it. He said, "Oh, we can use some of those in here." So from then on, I spent a day every once in a while up in the room where we had artificial flowers, making flower arrangements. And I did that for 8 years,
Wow.
making the flower arrangements. And on All Saints' Day, the people it was a Catholic community, and they all had to have a bouquet of flowers to put the graves. Sometimes you go out those graveyards on All Saints' Day, and they lit candles and put those flowers on the grave, and the whole cemetery would be lighted up. They had kind of changed up and they wanted me to work in the office half a day and on the floor half a day. And that didn't sound good to me because I was going to have to go to New Orleans to learn the office work. So I quit there. I had some time coming to me, so I quit. And I was at home about 3 days when one of my neighbors who owned a florist came over and asked if I would like to go to work for her. So I went over to the florist, and I worked there for 8 years on intestinal cancer twice.
But you've kicked it, right?
Sure did.
Good for you.
And my doctor told me if I lived 5 years without having cancer, it wouldn't come back in my colon. And it didn't. Timmy, oh, he didn't want to have anything to do with me. And he'd sit in the chair over there and play with something he'd had, and Frank had to go somewhere, and he sat there. All at once he laid that down and come and got in my lap and put his arms around me, and ever since then he's been a lovable little child with me. And he loved my pound cake.